Ben Thornton stood on Margaret Ellison's porch with his hat pressed against his chest and a letter folded twice in his shirt pocket. Behind him, his horse waited by the fence, already saddled, already packed. In 3 months he had fixed every broken thing on this ranch except the one thing that mattered most, and now he meant to ride away before it broke him instead. "I should leave," he said, "before I fall for you." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. The evening light was turning gold behind the mountains, and somewhere out past the barn a horse nickered low. She did not cry. She did not argue. She only smiled, the way she'd smiled at him the very first week, when she'd caught him fixing a gate hinge nobody had asked him to touch. Then stopped trying to leave. Ben's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're asking me to give up." "I know exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking you to stay for something instead of running from everything." He opened his mouth to answer her, and that was the moment a rider at the tree line turned his horse and vanished into the dark without a sound, carrying with him the one piece of information that could still ruin them both, that Ben Thornton was leaving town by sunrise, and that the road he'd take ran straight past Miller's Crossing, where a man could disappear a person without anybody in town hearing a single shot. Neither Ben nor Margaret saw him go. They had no way of knowing yet that the answer to a question 3 months in the making was about to cost them almost everything. To understand how two strangers ended up standing on that porch with a letter and a lie between them, you have to go back to April, when Margaret Ellison buried her father and inherited a ranch she didn't know how to save. Arthur Ellison died on a Tuesday, quietly, in the same bed he'd slept in for 30 years, and left his daughter 400 acres, 60 head of cattle, a barn with a roof that leaked in 3 places, and a debt at the bank that nobody had told her about until the funeral was barely over. Margaret was 26. She had buried a husband 2 years before that, lost to a fever that took half the county with him, and she had told herself back then that she'd already survived the worst thing life could hand her. Her father's death proved her wrong. Grief, she was learning, did not wait politely for a person to recover from the last round before it came back for another. The ranch didn't care that she was grieving. The cattle needed feeding whether she had the heart for it or not. The fences kept falling in the wind. And the bank in Cheyenne expected its payment before the first snow, whether Margaret had found a way to make the herd profitable again or not. She had one option left, and she knew it. Find help, or lose everything her father had built. It was Walter Granger, the blacksmith, who mentioned it to her almost as an afterthought one morning while shoeing her mare. "There's a fellow come through town looking for work," Walter said, not looking up from the hoof in his lap. "Quiet sort. Name's Thornton. Fixed my wagon wheel in under an hour and wouldn't take a cent more than what we agreed on. I'd vouch for him if you're still needing hands before the frost." Margaret hadn't planned on hiring a stranger. But she was out of better ideas, and out of time, so the next morning she rode into town to find him. Benjamin Thornton was leaning against the livery fence when she found him, hat low, sleeves rolled to the elbow, watching a colt work a corral like he had nowhere else on earth to be. He straightened when she introduced herself, and something in the careful, guarded way he looked at her told Margaret this was not a man used to being looked at kindly. "Walter says you're reliable," she said. "I try to be. I need fences mended, a barn roof patched before winter, and somebody who can work cattle without needing to be told twice. I can't pay much. I can offer the bunkhouse and 3 meals a day on top of the wage." Ben considered that for a moment. "That'll do." He didn't ask why a young widow was running a ranch alone. He didn't offer his own story either. Margaret decided she liked that about him immediately, though she wouldn't have admitted it out loud for anything. He started work that same afternoon. He arrived at the ranch with almost nothing, a bedroll, a weathered saddle that had clearly been resewn more than once, and a canvas bag that held everything else he owned in the world. Margaret noticed that and said nothing about it, though she found herself, that first night, setting an extra blanket outside the bunkhouse door rather than knocking to offer it directly. Ben Thornton worked the way a man works when he has spent years learning that idle hands invite idle questions, and questions were the one thing he'd built a life around avoiding. He was up before the sun without fail. He mended the fence line along the north pasture in 4 days flat, reset the corral gate that had been dragging in the mud since March, and climbed onto the barn roof with a competence that told Margaret, watching from the yard below, that Walter's recommendation had been well earned. He said little those first weeks. Margaret, still raw from her father's death and short on patience for idle company, found she didn't mind the quiet at all. They settled into a rhythm without ever discussing it. Ben on the roof or in the pasture from sunup. Margaret tending the herd, the accounts, and the house. Supper together each evening at a table that had felt far too large for one person since April. "You don't talk much," she observed one night, halfway through a meal eaten mostly in comfortable silence. "Never had much reason to," Ben said. "A man who moves from job to job learns fast that talk slows the work down and rarely changes how it ends. That's a lonely way to look at conversation." "Might be." He considered that, chewing slowly. "Hadn't thought of it as lonely till you said so." She caught him, more than once, working past dark without complaint, and found herself, against her own better judgment, carrying a lantern out to the barn so he wouldn't have to finish a repair by feel alone. "You needn't stay out here on my account," he told her the first time. "Wasn't planning to stay," Margaret said, setting the lantern on a post. "Simply didn't care to explain to the doctor why my hired hand fell off a roof in the dark. Practical concern. Entirely practical." She lingered anyway, longer than the lantern strictly required, watching him work with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to see anything on her farm improve instead of merely survive. He had, she came to discover, a habit of fixing things whether or not they were actually broken. She found him one afternoon adjusting the latch on the chicken coop, a latch she'd used without complaint for 3 years. "That wasn't broken," she said. "It bothered me," Ben answered, not looking up. "Latch should stick a little on the way down. That's how you know the coop's properly shut for the night." Later that same week, Margaret found him crouched beside the porch steps, testing each board with his boot heel one at a time. "Something wrong with my porch now too?" "Fourth board soft," Ben said. "Wouldn't give out today. Might in a month, first hard frost that swells the wood wrong." "And you noticed this how, exactly?" "Same way I notice most things. Wasn't looking for trouble. Trouble's usually looking for you first if you let a ranch sit too long without walking it proper." He glanced up at her, the corner of his mouth almost lifting into something like a smile. "You've got a good ranch here, Mrs. Ellison. Just needed somebody willing to walk every inch of it instead of only the parts that were already easy. I don't know that I trust a stranger's opinion on my chicken coop. I've fixed half your ranch in 6 weeks. Ought to count for something toward trust." "It counts for something," she allowed, fighting a smile she didn't fully win against. "I haven't decided yet exactly what." A hard rain caught them both out in the north pasture in mid-June, the kind of sudden squall that turned dry ground to mud before a person could reach shelter. Margaret had gone out to help move the herd closer to the barn, and by the time the storm broke fully open above them, there was no sense in running for the house. Ben pulled her under the overhang of the old feed shed instead, both of them soaked through, both of them laughing despite themselves at how thoroughly the weather had beaten them. "Some rancher I am," Margaret said, wringing water from her sleeve. "Can't even read a sky. Sky doesn't always give you warning. Learned that the hard way more than once." Ben glanced sideways at her, water dripping from his hat brim. "You've got mud on your face." "So do you. Suppose we're even, then." They stood there longer than the rain required them to, shoulders nearly touching, neither one in any particular hurry to end it, and Margaret would think back on that hour more than once in the weeks that followed. Not because anything happened, but because of how easy the silence between them had become, and how much she'd missed silence that didn't feel lonely. It was a trip into town for supplies near the end of June that gave Margaret her first real glimpse of what those careful wages meant to him. She watched him step into the post office ahead of her, count out coins with the precision of a man who had done the same errand more times than he cared to number, and hand it to the postmaster without either of them needing to discuss the amount. Samuel Bennett, the postmaster, filled out the money order with the easy familiarity of routine. "Same as always, Mr. Thornton." "Same as always, Samuel." Outside, Margaret asked him about it. "6 years running," Ben said. "Wherever the work takes me, the post office is generally my first stop before I've even found where I'm sleeping that night. That's a considerable habit to keep. Wasn't much choice in it." He didn't elaborate further, and Margaret didn't push. But she noticed the way his shoulders had gone a little stiff, the way a man's do when he said more than he meant to. That evening, over supper, he told her the rest without her asking twice. His father had died when he was 19, leaving behind a mother, Helen, and a younger sister, Emily, who was 12 at the time and dreamed of becoming a schoolteacher. There had been no ranch to inherit, no land, nothing but debts and 2 people depending on him. Ben had been sending money home every month since, moving from job to job wherever the wages were steadiest, never staying anywhere long enough to be asked to. "Emily wants to go to a teacher's college in 2 years, he said. "That takes money I can't earn standing still." "And your mother?" "Her health's not what it was. She doesn't say much about it in her letters, but I can tell." He looked at his plate rather than at Margaret. "I send what I can. It's never quite enough to stop worrying, but it's enough to keep them fed and warm, and that has to be worth something." Margaret understood, in that moment, that Ben wasn't distant because he didn't care about people. He was distant because he cared about 2 people so much that he built his entire life around a promise never to let anyone else matter as much. And she understood something about herself too, that she had spent 2 years telling everyone in town she was managing just fine alone, when the truth was she had simply stopped letting herself hope for anything different. "What did you want, before all this?" Ben asked her one evening, nodding toward the ranch beyond the window. "Before your father, before your husband. Before any of it needed saving." Margaret considered the question longer than she expected to. "I wanted to see the ocean once." Silly thing to want, growing up on a cattle ranch in the middle of the territory. "My mother had a postcard of San Francisco Bay pinned above the stove, and I used to stare at it while I did the dishes and tell myself I'd see it myself one day. Doesn't sound silly to me." "It does when you're standing in mud up to your ankles, chasing a stray heifer that doesn't want chasing." "Man can want 2 things at once," Ben said. "Chase the heifer today. See the ocean someday. Don't see why one has to cancel the other out." He said it plainly, the way he said most things, but Margaret found herself thinking about it long after he'd gone out to check the horses for the night, that maybe he was speaking about more than just her. By July, half the county had noticed how often Ben Thornton's horse was tied outside the Ellison ranch after sundown, and small towns being what they are, noticing quickly turned into talking. Margaret heard the first version of it from her neighbor, Louisa Caro, who delivered it with the particular relish of a woman who considers herself only the messenger. "Folks are saying you've gotten awfully close to your hired man, Margaret. Folks can say whatever they please. It changes nothing about how the ranch gets run. But it did change things." Margaret noticed the way conversation stopped a beat too long when she walked into the general store. She noticed the sideways looks after church, the way some of the older women no longer met her eyes. Ben noticed it too, and it put a hard line in his jaw that hadn't been there before. "I could take work elsewhere," he offered one evening. "Wouldn't want your name dragged through anything on my account. I don't care what people say about me. I understand that. But rumors turn dangerous fast when somebody with money to gain decides to use them." Margaret hadn't thought of it that way until he said it, and later she would understand exactly how right he'd been. The rumors followed her into church that Sunday. Margaret felt it the moment she stepped through the door. The particular silence of a room that had just stopped talking about her, the way 3 older women near the back pew found something urgent to examine in their hymnals rather than meet her eyes. Louisa Caro, seated near the front, turned around just enough to make certain Margaret noticed her noticing. Margaret sat through the service with her spine straight and her chin level, the way her mother had taught her to sit through anything unbearable, and said nothing to anyone about it afterward except to Ben, once she was home and the front door was shut behind her. "They looked at me like I'd done something shameful," she said. "For hiring a man to fix my fences. Folks don't need much of a reason," Ben said. "Just need somebody willing to give them one. I hate that they get to decide what my life looks like from a church pew. Then don't let them." He said it simply, but there was something steady underneath it that settled her more than any argument could have. "You're not the first widow this county's whispered about, and you won't be the last. Don't mean the whispering's true, or that it gets to run your ranch for you." The man with money to gain was Harold Dunmore, a cattleman who had been trying to buy the eastern half of the Ellison land since before Arthur died, and who had made Margaret two increasingly unfriendly offers since the funeral, both of which she'd refused without hesitation. Dunmore did not take refusal well, and he had begun, quietly, looking for a way to make refusal impossible. The rumors about Margaret and her hired hand were the first tool in that plan. They weren't the last. The storm hit on the second week of August, the kind that turned the sky green before it turned black and left the ranch smelling of rain and torn earth by morning. When Ben went out at first light to check the herd, 11 of Margaret's best cattle were gone. The east gate stood open, deliberately unlatched rather than storm-broken, and fresh tracks led off toward the old Miller trail that hadn't been used in years. Because Ben had been the last man near the herd the evening before, and because he was still, in the town's eyes, an outsider with no roots and no history anyone could vouch for beyond 6 weeks of hard work, suspicion settled on him before the mud had even dried. Sheriff Colby rode out that same afternoon. "I'm not accusing you of anything, Thornton," the sheriff said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But I need to ask where you were last night." "In the bunkhouse. Alone." "Nobody to say so?" "No, sir. Nobody." Margaret stepped between them before the conversation could go further. "He's worked this ranch for 2 months without a single complaint from me. I trust him completely." "With respect, ma'am, trusting a man and proving his innocence aren't the same thing." Ben said almost nothing that night, but Margaret found him afterward, sitting on the porch steps with his hat in his hands, looking like a man already rehearsing his goodbye. "I should go," he said. "Before this costs you the ranch along with your reputation. You didn't take my cattle. That's not the same as being able to prove it." "Then we'll prove it," Margaret said, and something in her voice left no room for argument. "I am not sending away the one person who's fought harder for this ranch than anyone but my own father did." Margaret began asking questions the sheriff hadn't thought to ask, and the first answers came, unexpectedly, from the blacksmith. Walter Granger turned over the horseshoe prints Ben's own mare had left in the mud beside the man's boot tracks and frowned at something only he seemed to notice. "These wagon tracks by the gate," he said. "Wheels mismatched. One's a standard rim, other's been fitted with an off-brand iron I only ever sold to one outfit in this county." "Whose outfit?" Walter hesitated, the way a man hesitates when he knows the answer will cause trouble. "Dunmore's." Samuel Bennett, when Margaret asked him a careful question at the post office 2 days later, remembered something of his own, a letter Dunmore had sent to a buyer in Laramie the week before the theft, and an unusual amount of correspondence between Dunmore's foreman and a man nobody in town recognized. "Struck me as odd at the time," Samuel admitted, "but a postmaster minds his own business about who writes to whom. I only remembered it because the fella asked twice whether letters addressed to your ranch, Mrs. Ellison, came through here regular." Margaret brought what she'd learned to Sheriff Colby that same afternoon, laying it out the way her father had taught her to lay out a set of accounts, plainly, in order, with nothing left to guesswork. "A mismatched will iron and a few letters," the sheriff said, unconvinced. "That's not proof, Mrs. Ellison. It's a place to start looking, which is more than you've given Ben since the morning those cattle went missing." Colby studied her for a long moment, the way a man studies someone he's beginning to realize he underestimated. Where do you suggest I look, then? The old Miller Trail. If someone drove 11 head of cattle off my land in a storm, they didn't do it quietly, and they didn't do it far. I intend to see for myself before the tracks wash out entirely. That's not a ride for a woman alone. It's my ranch, Sheriff. My cattle. My name being dragged through every parlor in this county. Margaret held his gaze without blinking. I'll go with or without your blessing. I'd simply prefer to have it. Colby exhaled, clearly recognizing an argument he wasn't going to win. Give me 2 days to look into the wheel iron properly. If it points where Walter thinks it does, I'll ride out with a warrant instead of you riding out with nothing but a lantern. Margaret agreed to wait, for 2 days, at least. It was patience she would come to regret, though not for any reason the sheriff could have predicted. Piece by piece, the picture came together. The cattle theft hadn't been random misfortune. It had been planned, time to follow the rumors, time to leave Ben looking guilty and Margaret looking desperate enough to finally sell. Margaret found where the stolen herd was being held 2 days later, an abandoned line shack near the old Miller Trail, exactly where the tracks had led. She rode out alone at dusk to confirm it with her own eyes, carrying nothing but a lantern and her father's ledger book to record what she found. She didn't expect anyone to already be waiting there. The men holding the cattle weren't Dunmore himself, he was too careful for that, but 2 hired hands who recognized Margaret the moment she stepped into the lantern light, and who understood immediately what her presence meant for their employer's plan. You shouldn't have come out here alone, ma'am, one of them said, and there was nothing polite left in his voice. They didn't hurt her. But they took the ledger, shoved her toward the shack, and one of them struck a match against the dry timber wall on his way out, low and almost careless, as if a fire out here would simply look like one more thing the storm had caused. Margaret smelled the smoke before she saw the flames catch the old, dry wood. She had gone out there to gather proof, and now she was trapped in a burning shack with nothing to show for it but her own stubbornness and no one within 5 miles who knew where she'd gone. Ben knew. He had noticed her missing the moment the sun went down, found her horse's tracks leading toward the Miller Trail, and ridden out faster than he had ridden anywhere in 6 years, because for the first time in a long time there was somewhere he needed to be more than he needed to keep moving. He reached the shack as the roof beam cracked and the whole structure groaned toward collapse. He didn't hesitate at the door. He went in through the smoke, found Margaret coughing on the floor near the window where she'd been trying to force the boards loose, and pulled her out through a gap in the wall seconds before the roof gave way behind them. They lay in the wet grass afterward, both of them coughing, both of them alive, watching the shack burn down to nothing. You came back, Margaret managed, once she could speak without coughing through it. Didn't consider not coming. She looked at him then, soot streaked across his face, his hand still shaking slightly from how fast he'd ridden, and something in her finally gave way that she'd been holding steady since April, since her father's funeral, since the bank's letters, since every night she told herself she could carry all of it alone if she simply refused to stop. I was so afraid, she admitted, her voice breaking on it. Not of the fire. Of nobody knowing where I'd gone. I knew, Ben said. I'll always know where to look for you now. That's not something I'm willing to give up, whatever else happens after tonight. He reached out and brushed a streak of ash from her cheek, his hand lingering there longer than the gesture required, and for a moment neither of them moved, the burning shack throwing orange light across both their faces, the whole night gone quiet except for the crackle of the fire and the sound of their own breathing. Ben. I know, he said softly, before she could finish. I feel it too. Have for a while now. He didn't close the distance between them, not that night. There was still a sheriff to speak with, still a fire to report, still too much unfinished between them for either to trust the moment fully, but he took her hand and held it the entire ride back to the ranch, and neither of them let go until the porch light was in sight. The ledger burned with the shack, but it no longer mattered. Between what Margaret had seen with her own eyes and what Walter and Samuel had already pieced together, there was enough now to bring the truth to Sheriff Colby. Within the week, Dunmore's 2 hired hands confessed under questioning, and Dunmore himself, unable to talk his way clear of the evidence stacked against him, left the county before the circuit judge could summon him to answer for it. Margaret's cattle were recovered. Her name was cleared of every rumor that had ever touched it. Ben's, too. But the fire had changed something in him that no confession could undo. He had come within a breath of losing her, and it had shown him, more clearly than 6 years of careful distance ever could, exactly how much he stood to lose by continuing to run from anything that mattered. The letter arrived 9 days after the fire, and it could not have come at a worse time or a better one, depending on how a person chose to look at it. A cattle operation 2 counties west was offering Ben a foreman's position at nearly triple his current wage, steady work through the winter and beyond, the kind of money that could finally send Emily to teacher's college without Ben lying awake calculating whether there'd be enough left over for his mother's medicine. He read it twice in the bunkhouse before he told Margaret about it, and when he finally did, 3 days later, she was hurt less by the offer itself than by how long he'd sat on it without a word. "You were going to tell me when?" "I was still deciding what there was to tell." "That's not an answer, Ben." "No," he admitted. "It isn't." It became their first real argument, quiet but sharp, the kind that reveals more than either person intends. "I'm not asking you to give up on Helen and Emily," Margaret said. "I would never ask you that. I'm asking why the first thing you did with an offer this size was start planning how to leave instead of how to tell me about it." "Because telling you about it means deciding whether I'm willing to stay," Ben said, quieter than she'd ever heard him. "And I've never once in 6 years let myself decide that about anything. Easier to keep moving than to risk wanting something I might lose. So the plan is to keep leaving before anyone gets close enough to matter. Forever." "The plan was never supposed to include you," Ben admitted, and for the first time since she'd met him, his voice cracked slightly on the words. "That's the trouble. None of this was supposed to happen the way it has." Margaret felt something in her chest ease and break at the same time, hearing that. "And what happens," she asked softly, "when you finally run out of places left to go?" He didn't have an answer for that. Not that night. He only picked up his hat, murmured something about checking the horses, and walked out into the dark, leaving Margaret alone at the table with a cold supper and a fear she hadn't let herself feel since the day of her father's funeral, the fear that she had let herself hope for something, only to watch it saddle up and ride away after all. Which brings the story back to where it began, Ben on the porch with his hat in his hands, his horse saddled behind him, the letter folded twice in his pocket, and Margaret standing in the doorway refusing to let him hide behind good intentions dressed up as sacrifice. "I should leave," he told her, "before I fall for you. Then stop trying to leave. You don't know what you're asking me to give up." "I know exactly what I'm asking. I'm asking you to stop believing that loving someone means abandoning everyone else you love." Ben stood there a long moment, hat still in his hands, and admitted the truth he'd been outrunning for 6 years. He wasn't afraid of Margaret. He wasn't even afraid of failing at the ranch, or the rumors, or Dunmore's men, or anything else this summer had thrown at him. He was afraid that choosing his own happiness would make him a poor son and a poor brother, that there wasn't enough of him to go around if he let himself want something just for himself. Margaret didn't ask him to choose between her and his family. She offered him something he hadn't let himself imagine as possible. "Become my partner here," she said. "Not my hired hand. My partner. We grow the herd, we grow the ranch, and there's more than enough in it to keep sending money home to your mother and Emily, same as you always have. You don't have to leave the people you love to build something of your own. You just have to let somebody build it with you." Ben crossed the porch and took her face gently in both hands, the same careful way he handled everything he'd ever cared about keeping whole, and kissed her the way a man kisses someone when he has finally stopped counting the reasons not to. Margaret kissed him back with everything she'd spent 2 years telling herself she no longer had room to feel, and when they finally broke apart, both of them a little breathless, both of them smiling in a way neither had managed in a long while, Ben rested his forehead against hers. "I'm still going to write that ranch 2 counties west," he murmured. Good. Just to tell them no. Even better. Margaret laughed softly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Because I already told the bank I'd be needing a partner's signature on next spring's loan, and I had a particular name in mind. Bit presumptuous, Mrs. Ellison. I've been called worse things by better people than a stubborn rancher who fixes latches that aren't broken. Fair enough, Ben said, and kissed her again. It was that same night, out past the fence line, that a rider paused at the tree line and watched the two of them standing together in the lantern light through Margaret's open door, the same rider who had watched them once before, back when there had still been something to gain from tearing them apart. He turned his horse and rode on this time without any letter to carry, without anyone left in the county willing to pay for what he'd seen, and by morning nobody in Wyoming Territory much cared where he went. Ben Thornton stayed. The partnership papers were drawn up before the first snow. By spring, the herd had grown by a third, the barn had a roof that didn't leak in a single place, and Helen and Emily Thornton arrived by stagecoach in April to see for themselves the ranch their son and brother had finally decided to call home. Emily took one look at the freshly mended gate hinges, the tightened latches, the repaired fence line stretching further than any fence needed to stretch, and laughed so hard she had to sit down on the porch steps. He's done it again, hasn't he, she said to Margaret. Fixed everything whether it needed fixing or not. Every single day since he arrived. That's how you'll always know he loves you, Emily said, still grinning. Ben Thornton doesn't say much. But he'll fix your whole world quietly, one hinge at a time, and never once ask for thanks. Helen Thornton, watching her son across the yard, said less, but the look she gave Margaret when the two women shook hands needed no further words between them. It was the look of a mother who understood, without being told, exactly what kind of woman had finally convinced her son that staying was not the same thing as standing still. Walter Granger took to telling anyone in town who'd listen that he'd known the two of them were meant for each other from the very first week, a claim nobody quite believed but nobody bothered arguing with either. Samuel Bennett swore he'd known it even earlier, on account of how much longer Ben's letters home had gotten once June arrived. Dunmore never returned to the county. Margaret's ranch, by the following autumn, was turning the kind of profit her father had only ever dreamed about, and for the first time since she was a girl, Margaret found herself marking places on a map she actually intended to visit, rather than places she'd simply given up on ever seeing. Ben Thornton, a man who had spent 6 years believing that responsibility and happiness could never sit at the same table, finally learned otherwise. He kept sending money home every month, same as always, only now the letters that went with it were longer, and happier, and signed by a man who had finally stopped running long enough to build something worth staying for. Margaret kept her father's old ledger habit alive, only better than before. Where Arthur had once tracked his cattle and expenses in loose scraps of paper tucked into drawers, Margaret and Ben together kept a single clean book. Every head of cattle counted and marked, every sale recorded, every debt and repair written down in plain figures a person could trust. It had been the missing evidence that nearly cost them everything once, and neither of them intended to let sloppy bookkeeping put their future at risk twice. What began as a hard lesson learned in a burning line shack became, in time, simply the way they ran a ranch worth trusting. And the town learned something too, slowly, the way small towns generally do. Louisa Caro was among the first to bring a pie to the Thornton table that autumn, and if she felt any shame over the whispering she'd carried through church that summer, she never said so out loud, though the pie, Margaret always thought, said enough on its own. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do isn't leaving to protect the people they love. It's staying long enough to build something worth protecting, for them, and for yourself. If this story found its way to you tonight, subscribe to see how many more like it are still coming, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I'd love nothing more than to say hello and find out exactly how far this story has traveled to reach you.